Howdy, and welcome to the Stoop. This is Cutter Gonzalez, your host, and welcome to Season 2 of our show. I am stoked to be back at it, and we have a really tactical episode to kick us off this year. In Season 1, our show featured stories of wins from pro-housing advocates around the country. And with each episode, we told the story of a different city or state that got pro-housing policy across the finish line. In Season 2, we will still hear those stories, but we'll also have some conversations arranged around certain topics rather than certain policy campaigns. This first episode of our new season is an out-the-gate example of that. In it, you'll hear from Anna Fahey and Daniel Herriges on how to talk about parking reform. We won't spend too much time on why parking reform matters. For that, I recommend learning from the folks in Washington State who were on the show in Season 1, Episode 12. Instead, today we'll be digging into brand new research on how to message a successful campaign for parking reform. But before we jump in, let me tell you a little about Anna and Daniel. Anna Fahey is Principal Director of Strategy for Sightline Institute, a think tank advancing public policy solutions in support of thriving, affordable communities, clean, green economies, and a healthy, resilient environment in Alaska, Montana, Oregon, and Washington State. Anna leads Sightline's communication and messaging strategy and oversees legislative engagement. She holds a BA from Smith College and an MA from the University of Washington. Daniel Herriges is the Policy Director at the Parking Reform Network, PRN. PRN is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to accelerating parking reforms by organizing advocates and educating policymakers and the public about the economic, environmental, and land use impacts of parking policy. Daniel is also the co-author with Charles Marone of Escaping the Housing Trap, the Strong Town's Response to the Housing Crisis. Daniel has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Minnesota. These folks are so good at what they do, and they have so much to share. Let's listen in. All right. Hey, Anna. Hey, Daniel. Welcome to the Stoop. So glad to have y'all on. So today we're going to talk parking, which is a kind of seemingly random thing a couple years ago. Now it's like all the rage in housing. We have like national level awards for parking, which is so nerdy and wonderful. And y'all have done some incredible work on how we talk about this issue that we're going to dig into throughout the episode. But before we do, just because I haven't had either of y'all on the Stoop before, and I'm personally curious, I would love to know your story and how you came to housing advocacy and maybe even parking advocacy too, if there's something there. Because I think that really roots our values and exposes the ways that we approach the work. And I'm so curious. You're both so wonderful. So let's start with Daniel, if you don't mind introducing us to you and your background.
Yeah. My name is Daniel Herriges. I'm the policy director at the Parking Reform Network. But I've been an urbanist pretty much my whole life, as far as I can tell. Always just, drawn to cities, lively places, diverse places, that energy. Lived in San Francisco after college, which radicalized me when it came to the housing market, as it tends to do. And ended up deciding that, land use reform advocacy was really what I wanted to do. Went to school for urban planning, and have never worked a day as a planner. But I got hired shortly out of planning school by Strong Towns, a national advocacy organization. So I was with them for about 6 years, running their content program and doing a lot of writing, and then made the switch over to parking reform.
Yeah, San Francisco will certainly radicalize you on the housing prices. I've looked. I'm in Austin, and it's getting better here, but the San Francisco market is nuts. I also studied planning and only briefly worked as a planner for the city of Austin. I did finally have a resume line item that said planner, but it was so brief. And the rest of my time's been advocacy, so share that with you. Anna, tell us about you.
Yeah, so I work for Sightline Institute, which is a small public policy think tank. We're very much about sustainability, and I started working mostly on climate and energy policy and sort of messaging strategies around that body of work. And I have to say, because of my own housing prices and rent going up, but also just sort of understanding the mechanisms and the kind of rules and regulations behind urbanism and housing policy, I'm definitely a convert to the school of thinking that housing policy is climate policy. So I've been working in that space at Sightline for the last, I don't know, almost 10 years now. But what really jazzes me up about it is just sort of that win-win-win, the big picture. Obviously, Sightline's work and my work at Sightline has been motivated at its root by sustainability and climate change, curbing air and water pollution, curbing sprawl. And you make a huge dent in this by ensuring that there are homes, that there are housing options people can afford close by where they live, where they work, their schools, transit, the things they need. And that's a huge win. The mega commutes take their toll on the environment and also on people's lives who don't have a choice because of what they can afford. So along the way, that housing availability and affordability also makes the places we live, our towns, our cities. I lived in Seattle for a couple decades and now live in a small town outside of Seattle. All those choices make our cities and towns welcoming and affordable for people who we rely on every day. Something I do that makes my teenagers roll their eyes like out in the world when I'm interacting with people. I'm constantly asking, like, the grocery store checker, my hairdresser, our kids' teachers, like, what their commute is like. And you'd be amazed at just the housing stories first that you get in those conversations, that connection around this problem, and the incredible share of people that you interact with every day who have like an hour each way commute to get to their job. Even in like a small town where, the housing crisis isn't sort of on the tip of everyone's tongue all the time. Anyway, so huge win-win-win in this space for like everything from big picture environment and climate to people's lives and what they can afford in my community. And then, of course, like the way the built environment impacts how we live. So sprawl and getting around.
I forget sometimes that Sightline is like climate and sustainability forward because I know you so much through the housing space that it's like, oh, Sightline is like housing people. And y'all do that so well. I mean, all that you do. And it's evident throughout the work that is a through line. But we have kind of, between the two of y'all, different approaches that complement each other so well. The background in Strong Towns, which so often focuses on kind of the development math, the making it pencil, also the cost to our cities and towns and governments of housing in a less efficient, less climate friendly way. And then Anna with your mention of climate change and sustainability, and now coming together on parking reform as something that brings all that together. Daniel, I'm wondering if you could, because you're currently with Parking Reform Network, could you talk about that kind of journey from the Strong Towns place to like PRN?
Yeah. I mean, the amazing thing about parking reform is it touches on everyone's issue while being this kind of wonky thing that, I mean, I still routinely have conversations with people like my dentist or something, or like, another parent at my kid's preschool. Like, so what do you do? And their eyes glaze over as soon as they hear the word parking. It's just like, why on earth would you want to devote a career to parking policy? But, I mean, the reason that we have a parking reform network, the reason that my colleague Tony Jordan founded it, and I think the importance of having an organizing space for this work is that parking affects everyone's priority, whether it is abundant and affordable housing, whether it is decarbonization, climate adaptation, whether it is safe streets, active transportation, accessibility for people with disabilities, like you name it. And you can actually see that in action when you look at successful parking reform campaigns and you read the list of like the coalition partners or the sponsoring organizations. It's astounding. It's just like, how on earth do you get all these people in a room? And the answer is that parking is just like the secret thing that is the reason you can't have nice things for so many different kind of issue areas.
Yeah, it does bridge those divides. I mean, like on those coalition letters, you see, I mean, in this call, right, we have a range of starting points. We're approaching this. And my background, my academic training is in geography, urban planning. And so I have a kind of environmental bent, probably akin to Anna and Sightline. But I also grew up in kind of deep red conservative Texas where like we were constantly being told, oh, like the city spends too much and all the financial stuff mattered most. And so I kind of had these like hearing you both talk about this, I'm like, wow, it's quite a range. But it all bears on this issue. And I'm curious what y'all think made parking kind of blow up now, because this work is not new at all. Like y'all have been doing this work and your colleagues have been doing this work for decades, right? Large timescales. But now all of a sudden it seems like everybody's talking about parking. Everybody's doing something on parking. I mean, Austin, where I'm sitting, eliminated parking mandates. I think we're still the biggest city in the country to do that, but happy to be corrected. But why now? What's going on that made it different?
Daniel can probably speak to this, but my line is always that the housing shortage and the resulting cost and rent crises that we're experiencing across the country, of not having enough homes and not having the kinds of homes that people can afford has gotten so bad that it's this political opportunity, right? Like it sucks that it's that bad, but it does set the stage for energy and action in this space. And parking, I don't know, my experience has been that although Sightline, we've had a formal program for housing and urbanism for around 10 years. I think we first wrote about parking like 20 years ago, especially in our work around curbing sprawl. Not to, just throw the street cred out there. But there's energy around this right now because the housing work has become so critical. And I see parking as sort of the 2.0, like once you've kind of tackled some of the other issues around zoning and regulation for housing, parking becomes this like blaring siren of the next big thing that needs to be tackled.
I would co-sign that answer. I think it's worth emphasizing that there's been decades of work sort of developing the foundations of parking reform. Most notably the work of Donald Stoop at UCLA, who passed away about a year ago as of this recording, almost exactly a year ago, I think. But, worked in the economics trenches for 40 years on parking policy when absolutely no one else was doing this. And, you had the new urbanists in the 1990s were plugged into this issue. Their, planners were aware of it to some extent, but I absolutely agree that the thing that has driven kind of the virality of parking reform, the reason that if you look at the number of cities that have abolished their parking mandates, it's an exponential graph over the past decade. I think that's absolutely because of the housing crisis and the national conversation around that. And the realization that this is an important lever you can pull and should pull, and one that can bring in all these coalition partners and that can bring in bipartisan support and kind of cut across issues in a neat way, too.
Yeah, and I'm curious, too, about that exact thing. Like, again, we're mentioning, like, Austin to, I don't know how many other places. Like, Austin gets a rep for being a, blue city and a blue dot in kind of a red sea, of course. So it's probably less surprising that we're doing more urbanist things. But, like, we're still in the Texas context, and the state is not hostile to Austin doing parking reform. Which like that's a high bar here, right? Like anytime Austin does anything, the state is probably hostile to it by nature of Austin having done it. But like this is a thing that even locally traverses those boundaries, and certainly you see a variety of context, state and local, with different demographic characteristics doing this. And I'm really curious, like how that came to be. Because to your point about the coalitions, there's everything from like business interests to your urbanist like tech bro types, like how did that get stitched together? Because it seems very intentional and whether that was over 40 years or, this year for a campaign, it feels like that always ends up being the case.
I think the coalitional politics around parking reform is something that we've kind of discovered as we went along. You can look at specific initiatives, and often all that they have in common is that there was a champion, that somebody was really a geek about parking policy and made the issue a priority. And that can be for a number of reasons. I mean, you do see places, where it is kind of a property rights, free market, libertarian sort of thing almost. You see places where it's really, local business. You see reactive parking reforms in towns where like somebody had to buy up the beloved coffee shop next door to expand their parking lot because of local regulations, and everybody went, wait a minute. It becomes an issue in a lot of kind of idiosyncratic ways. I don't think that you could have looked at the sort of early places to do this reform and said, oh, you're going to have these massive coalition letters with everyone from organized labor to tenants unions to the Chamber of Commerce on them. But that's something that we've discovered that you can do around this issue.
Yeah, and then we'll get into the messaging research that we've done. But one thing that we found in sort of like I think it really is a parking pilled kind of situation. Once you see it, you kind of can't unsee it, right? Like, so if you're a home builder, big, small, big developer, or affordable housing provider, if you're a small business person, sort of sectors that might tend more conservative, you want to keep local staff on your payroll, or you're trying to expand your business and you run into obstacles around the required mandated parking. You're a homeowner with kids or grandkids, thinking about the housing that's going to be available for them, you feel it. And I do think beyond that, like when I think of places where parking reformers have had victories, it's really around this sort of sense of place and placemaking as well. I mean, we supported almost identical bills a year ago in Washington State, which has a Democratic trifecta in state government, and in Montana that has the opposite, right? With Democratic bill sponsors in Washington State and Republican bill sponsors in Montana, with some variation, but essentially using the same messaging in those two different contexts, because people get it, right, about the cost of housing, the availability of housing, and then about wanting to keep growth from just looking like sprawling development and strip malls in places that people care about. And we found in the message testing that those, that case making actually worked across party lines as well. So that sort of shored up the Montana-Washington kind of anomaly that we thought we were seeing.
It's encouraging to see that it's not anomalous. It's really, really heartening. And I think you're so onto something that there's like a shared set of values around place and what makes a place great that beautifully transcends, the very deep partisan lines that we feel today. I mean, we can't really overstate how deep those lines can be grooved into our social fabric right now. And so to see issues like this is a rare moment to really like celebrate coalition politics and what we have in common. And that always motivates me with parking. I'm like, it does seem kind of like, oh, it's this niche thing. We know it has huge impacts, but like it is a moment to be very, public spirited and civic minded when sometimes it can feel discouraging in this moment. We're recording this, in February of 2026. There's a lot going on. You mentioned, Anna, the parking, the messaging guidance, and let's dig right into that, because I would love if y'all could help just like lay it out like I've never seen it before. I have seen it because I work for Welcoming Neighbors Network and I've attended your wonderful webinars, but this podcast being a resource for folks to either revisit after it's been a while or encounter it for the first time, if you could just walk us through, I think that would be super helpful.
I can give sort of the big context, and then maybe Daniel, do you want to walk through the sort of three pillars?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start out. So the work follows on extensive message testing by Welcoming Neighbors Network and Sightline Institute, along with a super savvy communications consultant who's also a Welcoming Neighbors Network board member, I think founding board member, Jamal Rod, specifically on pro-housing solutions. So we did a bunch of, several rounds of qualitative research, focus groups, online journaling, and polling at the national level to develop a toolkit for communicating about pro-housing solutions. And a part of that work was to dig into attitudes and narratives about parking as well. So that was just kind of scratching the surface, and then building on that research and that sort of using that narrative framework as a launching pad. We worked with Parking Reform Network, Daniel and Tony, to look at what messages have actually been effective in the field or sort of on the ground around the country, and to kind of stress test those with and build out sort of a toolkit for communicating specifically about parking reform. And that also included focus groups and then a national poll dedicated just to parking messaging. And what we found in the housing work, and we've touched on this a little bit, is that the affordability crisis, which is like top of mind, it's in the news every day, all the elected officials are talking about it, even if some of them are dismissing it. Housing is like this top of mind issue, right? For people of all stripes. But what we found in the housing work, and then sort of like amplified or times 1,000 in the parking work, is that, well, this is an urgent issue, and people want solutions. They kind of are feeling it at the emotional level. They are not naturally inclined to make the leap over to like policy levers like parking or zoning or local regulations and building code to sort of understand either like the shortage or how the shortage and those common rules are driving the shortage and how that impacts kind of day-to-day experience of affordability. So that was kind of our challenge, is to take, the work is cut out for us, obviously, to sort of take this status quo parking mandates that are ubiquitous and literally nobody thinks about ever, and translate that whole body of policy solutions into messages and into sort of a narrative that could actually get people interested in these solutions. So it builds on that pro-homes messaging work, and then it mirrors that sort of like need to define this problem in a way that people take the direct route to effective policy solutions. And I will touch on one thing that relates to what we were talking about just now about sort of partisanship, is that one thing we found in the research is that that's kind of working in our favor is that people haven't thought about this, right? So this opens up an opportunity for us to sort of fill in the blanks, educate and inform a narrative in people's mind about how this impacts them, how change matters, and what that looks like. So Daniel can walk through kind of the structure of that framework that came out of that.
Yeah. I think I'd reiterate that really the key to starting here is just to talk about this issue, to do some basic education, with your audiences, most of whom don't have a firm idea about what they think of parking policy, what the importance of it is. It's not partisan coded. It's not ideological coded in people's minds. So there's an opportunity that's there with kind of starting from ground zero to really frame it. And I think what we found, through the message testing, where we basically had a bunch of hypotheses based on things that we've seen campaigns already saying, campaigns that were successful, So here's the starting point. We use this messaging. We think it works. And then what came out of the testing was, some themes, some ways you could organize the successful messages into a narrative that's actually going to lead people from square one of like, I don't know why anyone would care about parking, to the preferred policy outcomes. And so we've really conceptualized that in this guide as a 3-step framework, to not just, delivering talking points, but to telling a story about parking policy. And that storytelling starts with defining the problem. and really illustrating what the problem is for people. And the core is that the problem is about waste, and it's about costs that are borne by the community. It's about things that cost you too much, things that you can't have. Because of these parking policies, you've probably never given any thought to. And so what we find is the most successful messages do that. They lay out the problem by illustrating exactly what it is that we're losing under the status quo. And not in a narrowly housing-centric way, even though housing is often the impetus for this work. There are a bunch of dimensions in which you can make that point, using specific examples, things that are tangible. So in the context of housing, showing people, walking them through how each parking spot that is built can raise the rent of the apartment it's for by hundreds of dollars per month. And that's true whether the resident wants or is going to use that parking or not. That's true because it's a cost that is paid to construct the building, and that cost is part of the construction loan, and the rents that come in have to pay off that construction loan. So parking is adding hundreds of dollars maybe to your monthly rent, and people don't know that, and we can show them that. Communities are losing out on new housing also because of projects that just aren't viable under the existing parking requirements. They're either too expensive to build or there isn't the physical space. A lot of missing middle scale housing, a lot of housing in existing neighborhoods where there's really high demand is just impossible to shoehorn into a space when you have to account for 1.5, 2 or more parking spaces per home. You can talk about the environmental costs, especially the ones that are tangible to people. Asphalt traps heat, and dangerously high temperatures threaten people's health. We found that was a really, really resonant message with people. The loss of tree cover and urban greenery in order to accommodate required parking. Really, really effective message with a whole lot of people. The harm to local businesses. In just about any community, you can find local mom and pop business owners that couldn't open, couldn't expand, had to bear a bunch of extra costs. We're kind of, just had to deal with this onerous machinery of local parking requirements. These are really sympathetic figures. These are stories that people don't know. So the beginning of the parking reform storytelling is, let's show people, the people who are being hurt right now by these policies you haven't thought about. And then once we do that, we can pivot to illustrating a solution. What are the things that you could have that you value for your community if we didn't have these parking policies? You could have more home choices than local workers can afford. You could have more homes that seniors can downsize into, or that young families can get a start in. You can have more local businesses that offer local character, important services and amenities, services like childcare, people-friendly neighborhoods that are pleasant to stroll with your dog or kids. You kind of paint a picture. Here's the kind of community you want. Here are the things you're not getting because you're trading them away for overabundant parking. And then finally, to seal the deal, you got to offer people a clear action. And the way that we have found is most effective to frame that action is not in the negative. It's not eliminate parking mandates. It is create parking flexibility. Give people back the ability to make their own decisions about parking instead of having that decision dictated by an arbitrary bureaucratic formula. When you put it in those terms, people across the political spectrum, across the issue spectrum, are really, really receptive. And then you can have the discussion on your terms. Parking flexibility. You don't want to get bogged down in debating what is the right amount of parking. How do we know? Does this community need more? Does it need less? Is it hard to find a parking space? But who should be making the decision, and who do we trust to make that decision? And what we found is that the people who are actually going to be building the building and using the parking are more qualified to make that decision than a bureaucratic, antiquated formula. Often a formula that's been in your zoning code since the 1960s, So flexibility was really the core to the winning message here in terms of what are we asking our communities to do? Just give people the choice of how much parking to build.
Yeah, and I can maybe just echo some of that in sort of shorthand. So first part, define the problem specifically around waste and cost. In layman's terms, what's happening now is wasteful. We think that waste works as a frame because people can see it around them, like it's visual, empty parking lots. It's also just a concept that people can get, a word people would use themselves. And as Daniel alluded to, it gets us out of conversations where we're quibbling about how much parking is enough or too much, right? So we're not quibbling, debating the right answer because there isn't a right answer. And that's why we need to have flexibility. But what we're doing right now is wasteful. And so people, I think, can kind of get that as sort of defining the problem. And then next, we illustrate the solutions and particularly why they matter for people's lives. So again, here we want to connect solutions to things that people already care about, or that they can see as a benefit, opening doors to small local businesses, more affordable home choices. And again, this idea of places, like how our neighborhoods and our downtowns and our communities feel to be in, what it's like to live here, the places that we value in town, right? So the town center or like classic main streets. And then finally, showing the way forward to the action. So parking flexibility, as Daniel said, is common sense for people. The waste is not logical, but it is logical for most of the people that we tested these with, that in a particular context, location, type of business or type of housing or building site, they're all going to require different things. And so it's not about saying you can't have parking. It's about saying be flexible and stop being wasteful. Stop forcing a wasteful amount, because it just means more empty, expensive pavement. So, I mean, it's kind of this neat, tight progression from the problem to the solutions to the action. And I think it works because people can see it and it's logical.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward to make sense out of and be evocative, which is wonderful to have packaged in the same neat frame. That problem solution action PSA frame has been super tactical for me already. I'm a digital strategy manager at WNN, but at WNN we're all kind of pitching in on all the comm stuff, and we're thinking about that, like, okay, I need to approach this op-ed, this digital ads, whatever, and thinking through that PSA framework has some really practical uses really, really quick, which I appreciate. And to your point, I mean, I think we've all stood in like an empty or mostly empty Walmart parking lot and been like, this could be anywhere USA, derogatory, versus like a great main street in those cities and towns and across the country that we feel so placed in and so kind of wrapped in that community. And I think a lot of us as the country is suburbanized, find ourselves yearning for that kind of place. Daniel, when you were talking about the kind of, and Anna both, I think the kind of waste, the kind of mandates language, I think, given my upbringing here in Texas, so much of that I just assumed was like really easy right-coded stuff, right-wing coded stuff like, oh, well, the government shouldn't be telling you what to do kind of thing, But you're saying that kind of thing holds across ideological divides. Is that right?
I think it does. I think the language that is most resonant might be a little different, but it's not just a matter of, the government shouldn't be telling you what to do. I think for people maybe more on the political left, it's often about, for them, it's going to be about the specific things that the government is telling you have to prioritize. And, I care about climate. I care about environmental quality. I care about affordable housing. And one thing that I think, where there's a lot of, in our guide, there are specific examples of messages that tested really well. There's this kind of narrative structure. But I think sort of an overarching thing to reiterate here is this is an issue that cuts across so many people's prior, conceptions or priorities or ideological commitments, that you can meet people where they are. And what works for sort of messaging directed at a mass audience might not be what works in a one-on-one persuasion kind of context. Know your audience. If you're sitting down with one of your city council members and you want to sell that person on parking reform, you're not starting from ground zero. You're starting with some sense of like, what are the things they care about? And there's a ton of room around this issue to meet people where they are and to start the conversation with the thing that they're already bought in on.
Yeah, I would echo that as well, 100%. And this guide is not I mean, Jamal likes to say, this is not the Bible. You don't have to say these words verbatim. The structure is meant to give people kind of that broad narrative foundation, and then you build and adapt, as Daniel said, to your local context and audiences. And that is one reason that we do suggest, and this also tested really well and has worked well kind of in the field in advocacy campaigns, is to keep turning back to local examples, right? And so that's some of the guidance in the toolkit, is when we're defining the problem, saying waste and cost maybe works better than defining the problem in other ways, like arbitrary and excessive. But that's not quite enough. You still have to take the next step. What are the wastes and costs? So it's, more homes. We're preventing more homes and a housing shortage. We're preventing more daycares and a childcare shortage. And then find examples, find people in the community who can actually tell their story and illustrate what those costs look like on the ground. It has proven super effective for us to find sympathetic community members who can, show, don't tell this happening. Like a daycare, we used a story of a daycare entrepreneur, owner in Washington State in our advocacy there, and had her saying the words like, I had this site all ready to go. I was getting the permits and we were ready to put this facility in, but we realized that too much space on this lot was going to be taken up by the mandated parking. It was going to cost us too much. We didn't need that much parking, and we had to scrap the project, right? And this is like really hits home for people, especially anyone trying to find affordable childcare, close to home. Ditto, like I know in Texas, there's been a really great example of a local business or restaurant owner, or maybe like a bakery. I can't remember right now, but
Al's Cheesecakes in Dallas.
yes, cheesecakes. Like, how much more compelling can you get than daycares and cheesecakes, right? So he describes how he wanted to expand the restaurant, create some outdoor seating, and how it just wasn't going to work. He would have had to create X many more spots for parking based on this, blanket mandate. And it just didn't geometrically, physically work on the lot. And he knew too that his customer base weren't driving, they're coming from down the street or from the park across the street, and that it was just going to be this waste. So those are really powerful. And it's really important, I think, also to bridge any kind of polarization or partisan divides, to kind of really focus in on those local examples that just about anybody can relate to.
I remember the first time someone told me bars shouldn't have mandated parking, and it took me a second. So I was like, how did I never think of that? Because bars and daycares are the ones I hear all the time, where it's like, why do we require people to have car parking at a bar? Like, you're right that we shouldn't probably be incentivizing people to drive to the place where they're going to drink alcohol. And daycare similarly, where there's like a high influx at a certain pickup and drop off time, but not otherwise. And Anna, to your point, these costs are not always reconcilable with the needs of that business. And, bars, of course, I'm sure some people are like, well, we could go without as many bars, but daycares, childcare being kind of famously at this point in shortage across the country, much like housing. If that's the make or break to having care for your child during the workday, that makes a big, big difference. And, I'm thinking about my neighborhood, and I'm like, other than the public middle school, I'm like, there's not a daycare nearby. I think that's the case for a lot of people, and anything we can do to lower the bar to make those kind of places viable, I think is worth doing. To your point, though, about the local stories, not just the conceptual like I'm talking about right now, but like the local stuff. Do y'all have any advice on how folks could go about finding those stories and then, conveying those in the very local sense?
A couple of things you can do, and then maybe I'll turn it over to Anna because some of her colleagues at Sightline have done a lot of this kind of storytelling, story gathering. I mean, these people are out there in your community. You can, one thing you can do is you can just kind of talk to, business districts. You can chat with small business owners, just kind of not with a really aggressive kind of agenda, but, out and about in your neighborhood, and you'll encounter people who had some, I had this weird issue with zoning. That's why we didn't open up sooner. I'm glad you're glad that I'm open now. And another thing you can potentially do is look at what's actually going through like your planning commission. If somebody is applying for a parking variance, that is somebody who feels that the existing requirements are not working for them. Talk to your city planners, find out what were the variance requests that got denied. The business owner is probably not just like advertising that fact, but there's a story for every one of those.
Yeah, and it's a little out of my lane at Sightline, but my brilliant colleague Katie Gould, who won one of those national parking reform awards, thank you, Daniel, Parking Reform Network, is just really skilled at sort of reporting style research in support of our housing policy priorities. And so she, gets out there just as Daniel described and is talking to people, planners. We have found that it's super strategic in statewide campaigns for housing reform generally to get close with local elected officials because oftentimes there's like a United City lobby in your state that may have a divergent opinion about statewide public policy compared to some of their the local mayors and city councilors who they purport to represent. So you get lots of local stories from folks who are working in the community and who are hearing from local businesses. Or showing up at hearings, showing up who's petitioning city council to change something or asking questions because I just talked to a local bookshop owner in a town near where I live, and he was like, yeah, we'd love to put housing above this building that we own, but we think that we'd have to put in all this parking and it's not going to work and it's right downtown. So, it's kind of the scenario that Daniel described of like, we'd have to knock these other things down behind this building, these things people value in the community in order to make this work. And, he's a perfect advocate to set up. I think you also asked about sort of how you tell their stories. Sightline has a platform on our website to kind of like highlight stories and then share those around with lawmakers, et cetera. But you can also call on these folks to give testimony for a statewide bill, right? Like they are very compelling to lawmakers.
I think another group of people you can go to, and, for some of the audience here, if you're doing pro-housing advocacy, you're maybe already in touch with like small-scale home builders in your area, incremental developers. They'll have stories. They'll be able to tell you exactly how parking affected the numbers on their pro forma. Nonprofit, affordable housing developers. And of course, developer can be a dirty word in politics. So, the person who's going to come up and say, I'm a developer and he's depending on context is maybe not who you want being the face of your movement. But a lot of these people, especially the ones doing the small scale incremental infill stuff, they'll be quick to tell you, yeah, parking mandates are absolutely ruinous for a lot of the things I want to do. And here's why. And here are the numbers. And I can testify to those numbers.
Yeah. And some of the Parking Reform Network has done a brilliant job of kind of putting on full display the absurdity of some of the parking mandates in place. One of the ones that sticks out is kind of like requirements for like studio apartments in certain places to have 2 parking spots per unit. I don't know. Daniel can correct me, but it's, the numbers surprise you. And I think some work for the sort of the movement to do is to find compelling stories of folks who live in those places and how they are paying essentially for that space and that extra expense in the building that they live in, and they have one car or they have no car or whatever.
One thing we'll do is we will go out, PRN, when we're going to present somewhere. We'll do two things prior to, every local talk that we give. And one is we'll go and we'll do a survey of zoning codes in the region, and look up ridiculous parking mandates that exist. And you can always find them, especially for certain land use categories like bowling alleys, laundromats. Bowling is sort of the one that we use all the time because a lot of the zoning codes were written like in the 70s. Bowling was having a moment. There's always a very specific parking requirement for a bowling alley. And generally, if you take like towns within a 40-mile radius, you're going to find anywhere from 2 parking stalls per lane to 8 parking stalls per lane, and maybe every single number in between. And it just highlights for people the absurdity. Part of people not having thought this much about this issue is that one of the humps you have to get over with persuasion is to puncture the notion that these are inherently authoritative or scientific. The parking standards they must be there for a reason, right? Well, no, they're, roll a ball down the bowling lane and see how many pins are left standing. Hey, that's your parking requirement. That's about how rigorous these things are. So we will do that. We will find these examples just to sort of puncture the veneer of authority that these mandates have. We'll also pull some simple census statistics, which you can do anywhere. The one that we use a lot is the percentage of households in your city or state or whatever geography that have either 0 or 1 vehicles available to them. As 0 is often that's a small number. We live in America. But when you do 0 and 1, you're finding car light households. For renter households, that number is always greater than 50%. I presented recently in Montana, Missoula, Montana. Day of this recording, Missoula has abolished its parking mandates. Thanks in no small part, WNN has some presence in Montana. A lot of great people doing work there. But when I presented in Missoula, extremely car dependent place, more than half of renter households have 0 or 1 vehicles. So then it's really easy to go to the code and say, why are you requiring 2 parking spaces per apartment? Why are you requiring 1.5? You are requiring tenants to pay for parking they're not using.
Missoula being a great case too of a mid-sized city. It's 70 to 80,000 people. I had the privilege to go up there and talk with some of them, I guess a year and a half ago now. And they are just tackling it head on. It's people did pretend like you have to be 1 million people or more to do anything good on this, and it's not true. Missoula is the case. Sub 100,000 people and getting rid of parking mandates is phenomenal. Those advocates there on the ground are just killer. If they're listening, I love you, and you already know you're among my favorites. I can't say I have a favorite, but I have so many favorites in this movement. And I want to briefly draw back something you said because I think it's really important to highlight. 2 things. One, Katie Gould was also on this podcast in August of last year, episode 12, if you want to go back and listen. And Katie was on with Kate Burnett Cruiser from Washington because they were talking about some of the parking reform stuff in Washington. So you can see how some of this played out in that episode. But also, I think, Anna, the little gem of knowledge you just casually dropped for us was the relationship with the policy maker, your policy champion, as a way to get stories, because time and time again, they're hearing from constituents, they're hearing from, advocacy organizations, community organizations and groups, whether that's the Chamber of Commerce or groups that are pro-urbanist advocacy groups or whatever else. And they're often sitting on a trove of people's stories about this exact thing that you're talking about. And they can help say, oh, you're interested in talking about that. Well, so-and-so was in my office the other day. They could probably tell you why their daycare couldn't open or expand because of this. We're working on it right now. And that is something I don't think we've talked about on the show before. And it's not talked about enough, but the policymakers can often point you to great stories in the community. So I want to top line that. I think that's really, really important. As we're coming up on time here, I want to dig into the applicability of the research framework, because I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit when we were talking about, especially how Jamal likes to say it's not the Bible and that kind of stuff. But, where do you find this is most applicable, and where would you say use it as a starting point, react to it, but then add more?
I mean, we think it's applicable everywhere. We think everyone should be using it all the time, of course. Um, I'm sort of kidding, but sort of not. But it is important to point out, really bridging to what you just said too, Cutter, is the audience for these messaging tools are advocates like your listeners and like folks on this call, but also for lawmakers themselves, right? They need to be able to talk about this work in clear ways that resonate with their constituents and that give them the confidence to talk about the issue like a wonky, weedy issue in a way that feels compelling and feels authentic to them. And lawmakers are just regular people too, right? Like they have the same kind of emotional responses to language and words and frames that the rest of us have. So, it kind of does double duty. Like you're convincing the lawmakers by using the messaging with them that this is important, and you're also empowering them to talk about it in ways that are going to, assist them in getting policy passed.
I think that, yeah, the double duty thing is really key. We'll do so many talks that are, let me talk to you about how to talk about this. And I think a lot of the stuff in this guide, I hope is really applicable to advocates trying to just get out of their own way, get out of our own way. There are things in the guide that, as we're producing this, I'm like, ooh, I do this all the time. I should work out. And so some of that is using jargon, using advocate language that we're maybe very comfortable with to the point where we forget that, like Anna said, don't talk about arbitrary and excessive, talk about waste and costs and, just language that people are going to click with. And then something, there are some really good just kind of caveats in there. Keep it tangible, keep it real to people. Don't make it ideological. And I don't even mean left, right, Democrat, Republican, but like one of the biggest recommendations in this guide is don't make it a referendum on cars. If you make parking reform into an anti-car policy or you allow opponents to box you in that way, you're going to lose. Because we're in a country where most people travel by car or drive a car. And people who are thinking about parking in driver mode, they're thinking like, well, free parking is good, more parking is better, but I want to be able to park my car when I need to park my car. And what's really salient for them then is the loss aversion of what if we pass this policy and then there's not enough parking? And so the number one thing in the guide that we say not to do that a lot of our advocacy partners do is frame this as, we drive too much. We got to get people out of their cars. We got to promote alternatives to cars. We got to challenge car dependency. And what the research shows very clearly is in the context of persuading people to support parking reform, don't do that. Don't make it about cars. Make it about the trade-off. Make it about the waste that we are mandating with these stupid rules and like the nice things that you can have that you probably value more than maybe a little extra assurance that you might have a parking space when you want one.
Yeah, 100%. It's worth saying twice. This is not about cars versus no cars or driving versus no driving or even parking versus no parking. It's about placemaking and housing costs and trees. It's about you want to toggle people from that driver mode in which they are locked in and they live and it's hard to get out into like I live here mode. What is this place like to live in? What does it feel like here? And that is, most of this guide or a lot of this guide is essentially tools to sort of subvert or disrupt that default mindset that people have when they first think about parking. They think more is better. And we're toggling them to a different way of looking at it. And it's a conscious switch that advocates can make by how we start the conversation and what we emphasize. And just to point out, like, that stuff works with a subset of our audiences, like probably the listeners on this call again, right? Like, bless your hearts. It's not that we never talk about car dependence, but we need to bring other people along by other routes, so to speak. And then I will point out too, Daniel mentioned sort of be specific, be concrete, keep it local. avoid jargon. But when we're talking about cars, it's important to point out too that the environmental messages that test really well in this work are not about climate change or driving less. They are also local and tangible issues that people can really relate to kind of in a physical sense, kind of close to home. So stormwater pollution from pavement into local waterways, local trees. Protecting trees is really big. It cuts across every demographic group as the top priority. Pavement causing heat traps during periods of high temperatures and sort of the health dangers associated with that for people is really important. And then that whole category of protecting places from sprawling development that spreads everything out and spreads everyone out and erodes local habitat and open spaces, but also kind of erodes or tears at your communities or your city's feeling or sort of connected sense of place and the fabric of a place.
Yeah, I think that's very important. The car step is one I purposely wanted to talk about because I think there is such a range of opinion on how to like engage on that. And I was going to ask you more on this, but you kind of answered my question because I was like, what is it that reconciles cities like Paris and stuff that we now think of as like very progressive and very have decentered the car, but used to be historically very car dependent. Paris was extremely car dependent. Amsterdam, likewise, some of these cities we hear about in, urbanist lore were car dependent. And I was like, what is it that, that got them there if it wasn't being anti-car? Because some of the evidence says it was. But I think to your point that what advocates in those places did is they talked about the trade-off from cars. And, and they weren't always talking parking reform, but like, I think that even in those places, what they did is they did exactly what you're saying. They localized it. They said trees, they said daycares, they said kids walking to school, they said being able to be on the street. And you're very wisely asking us to bring that to bear on our context, which is, less transit rich, has a lot more car dependency than those places. And talk about that, the ways that, we can, without being hostile to cars or drivers, certainly open up new places for homes, for what's most meaningful to us, to the flexibility to live a life you designed. And I think that's wonderful. And I appreciate that. And just closing here, I want to open up the floor completely to whatever Anna, Daniel, y'all feel like we should cover before we break. If there's anything, there's so much I'm already chewing on. So, I'm sure y'all have so much wisdom to share even beyond this. I know because I work with y'all in different capacities. But what do you think we should know before we go?
I imagine that the resource itself will be shared out, or people will have access to it. So just want to flag that that's available, and we hope people will use it as a guide.
And echo that, yeah. As to echo Jamal too, who's not here with us, but it's not a Bible; it's a toolkit. Use it as hopefully a guide to give you the confidence to just talk confidently and compellingly about this issue. That like you can persuade just about anyone on this issue. And once you see it, it's like it's almost common sense. Like not to say that there isn't hard and thoughtful and careful work to be done in persuading people and building the coalition around parking reform. But like, I think the biggest takeaway is like, don't be afraid to talk about this. If you are in local elected office, don't be afraid to champion this. Every successful parking reform campaign, you can look at it, you can find a champion, usually a champion in elected office who just like wouldn't let the issue go. And don't be afraid to be that person. And if I may put in another plug for PRN, by all means, reach out to us with whatever questions you've got, whatever support you're looking for with your local campaign. We want to be a resource for that above and beyond what we've compiled in this guide.
Yeah, and I'd say on the flip side of that, we are eager for feedback too. I mean, we know that this was a starting place and that we have further work to do digging in on a certain, sort of the next level of parking reform messages, work on what you do next, like on-street management, spillover, parking questions that people have, etc. And so those are sort of 2.0 project ideas for us. I think there's more work to be done on sort of language that fills in the gaps that jargon kind of hold. So, some advice that we give is not to say walkable because it means something to us, but it doesn't necessarily evoke what you want it to evoke to the average bystander. And so we have work to do kind of finding replacement language for some of that jargon. And I'm always happy for ideas. If you have those, send them my way. And yeah, I think so in Washington State, the state policy that did pass is great. The political compromise that was made is that populations under 30,000 were carved out of the bill. And so I think there's work to be done too. And I would argue that smaller places, towns that are growing, that are seeing growth, kind of change the built environment, whether it's like more strip malls or drive-throughs or sprawl, more McMansions, replacing, like older, smaller homes. Those places actually have more to lose in some ways than the big cities in keeping rigid parking mandates on their books. So I would love to dig in more on sort of messaging specifically around smaller communities, smaller population places.
I love that. And I will eagerly await seeing you do that wonderful research. I'm a huge beneficiary of y'all's work, and I am just so grateful. So until next time, thanks so much for joining us here on The Stoop, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Cutter.
Thanks so much for having me.
We covered a lot of ground in this episode, and so much of it was deeply tactical stuff. To make sure these lessons are useful wherever and however you are doing your work, Anna and Daniel, along with Jamal and others, have prepared some written resources that you can save and view anytime or even print and carry with you. You can access this messaging guidance at welcomingneighbors.us/messaging. I keep a hard copy of the messaging guidance at my desk because it's helpful to flip through while I'm writing, and I imagine it will help some of y'all likewise. You can also follow along with Anna and Daniel's work online. Of course, Daniel works at Parking Reform Network, which is online at parkingreform.org. They are also on Blue Sky at parkingreform.org and on Instagram at parkingreform. Anna works at Sightline Institute, which is online at sightline.org. They are on Blue Sky at sightline.org and on Instagram at Sightline Institute. Of course, that Sightline is spelled SIGHTLINE.org. As always, you can connect with the Welcoming Neighbors Network online at welcomingneighbors.us and on social media. We are at WNN Pro Housing on Instagram and at welcomingneighbors.us on Blue Sky. The Stoop is produced in-house at the Welcoming Neighbors Network by me, Cutter Gonzalez, and my colleague Lauren Ray. The music for our show was created by my friend Nolan Hopkins. If you have ideas for our show, including special episodes, guests you'd like to hear from, or topics you'd like to cover, shoot me an email at cutter@welcomingneighbors.us or DM me on social media. My handle is at Cutter W. Gonzalez across all platforms. Thanks for joining us on The Stoop. Talk to y'all real soon.